Hey, Caleb, your mom's nervous. That's okay. Not everyone's built for this.
One condition. When this is over, you apologize to your students, not to me.
What the hell?
I think y'all need to see something.
Mom, what is?
And she hadn't been inside a gym in 14 years. She told herself it would be fine, just a pickup. Park outside, Caleb comes out, drive home. She didn't even have to go in, she went in. That was the first mistake, or maybe not a mistake, and maybe just the first thing that happened that she couldn't take back. The smell hit her before the door finished opening, and sweat, and rubber and leather, and that particular chemical mix that lived in training spaces, the kind that didn't wash out of walls or equipment no matter how many times you cleaned, and she knew that smell the way she knew her own hands. It lived in a part of her memory that didn't respond to decisions. Her body knew it immediately, her mind took a second longer. She found a chair in the waiting area along the wall, sat down, pulled her jacket tighter, and looked at her phone. She was going to be invisible. She was good at invisible. She'd had 14 years of practice. Nadine Webb was 42 years old, 5'6", and lean in the way that came from work, not from a gym. Her hands were rough, paint under her nails, most days even after scrubbing. She kept her hair natural, pulled back when she worked, loose at home, and no jewelry except a small silver ring on her right hand that she never took off and never explained. She painted houses for a living. Interiors mostly, exteriors in summer. 4 regular clients who called every year, new jobs through referrals, no website, and no social media. Her business card said her name and a number, printed at the pharmacy on white cardstock. Nadine Webb, painter, that was enough. She was good at being a person who didn't require much looking at. Work shirts, paint-stained jeans, work boots, and a face that was pretty in a way she actively worked against no makeup, a little sun damage. The expression of someone who had somewhere to be and would prefer you not interrupt. She'd spent years building that expression, and it worked most of the time. She read the same paragraph of a news article 4 times and retained nothing. The main floor was visible through a half-open partition. She could see it from where she sat if she looked up. So she didn't look up. She was fine. She was completely fine. And a clatter, not loud, just sudden. The kind of sound that happens fast and wrong. She looked up before she decided to. And on the main floor, and a young man early 20s, slim, and first or second year of training by his movement, had caught his heel on the edge of a mat, and he was going sideways, fast. Toward the metal corner of a folding table someone had left too close to the training area. Nadine was out of her chair. She crossed the distance in the time it took everyone else to register that something was falling. One movement, and she caught his arm, redirected his momentum, brought him down controlled, instead of into the metal edge, stood him up, checked the corner of the table, stepped back, 2 seconds, maybe less. She walked back to her chair, and sat down, looked at her phone. The waiting area went quiet for a moment, not dramatically. Just the small pause that happened when something unexpected occurred, and people were deciding how to respond. And the young man Avery, she would learn his name, later stood in the middle of the floor, looking slightly dazed, more from the speed of it than from any impact. He looked toward where Nadine was sitting. She wasn't looking back. From the center of the training floor, a taller young man had stopped mid-drill. And Caleb, her son. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read from here and chose not to try to read. Then his instructor called the class back and he turned away. Nadine looked at her phone. Her hands were steady, and after enough years and enough hours, hands like hers just stopped shaking regardless of what was happening inside. That was one of the things training gave you that never went away even when everything else did. She breathed through her nose, and in out. Fine, Caleb was 20 years old. He lived with his father during the week and saw Nadine on weekends, and sometimes the full 2 days, and sometimes just one depending on his schedule and his life, and which was appropriately full for a 20-year-old. And he was studying business at the community college, working part-time at a sporting goods store, figuring out the shape of himself, which was exactly what 20 was for. He had Nadine's eyes, dark and steady, and taking in more than they let out. And he'd been doing martial arts for 2 years. He had signed himself up, paid with his own money, never asked Nadine's opinion. And she'd found out 3 months after he started, when he mentioned it over dinner, the way you mention things that were already settled casually, without looking for a reaction. Oh, I'm doing MMA now, at this gym near the college. She'd put her fork down, just for a second, and then picked it back up, said that's good. And, you like it? Yeah, good. They'd moved on. She had not told him why the fork stopped. She had not told him about the last time she'd been in a space that smelled like this one. And she had not told him a lot of things. And the arrangement had always been, at least from her side, that Caleb got her present tense. Her mornings and her dinners and her Saturday afternoons, and her honest opinion on his coursework, and her full attention when he talked. And he didn't need her past. He'd never pushed. She didn't know if that was trust or if it was the knowledge, accumulated over 20 years of being her son, that certain doors in his mother's life didn't open. Either way, the doors stayed shut, and she drove to the gym on a Thursday because Caleb texted that his father's truck was in the shop. She'd looked at the text for a moment, just a moment. Then typed, "What time?" He said 7:30, and she said, "Okay." She told herself she'd wait in the truck. She sat in the truck for 4 minutes, then she went inside. The parking lot was fine. The sidewalk was fine. The sign above the door, Iron Fist Gym, black and red, the kind of lettering trying to be intimidating, was fine. And the smells was not fine. The smell was 14 years of something she had locked in a room at the end of a hallway. And it turned out that room had a door she hadn't fully accounted for. But she sat down. She was invisible. Nobody noticed her. This was going to be completely ordinary. Then Avery Sutton caught his heel on the edge of a mat, and Nadine's body did what it had been trained to do for 8 years before she made it stop. And the instructor's name was Briggs Holloway. She knew this from the window, Iron Fist Gym, Briggs Holloway, head instructor. She hadn't read further than that. She watched him now, through the partition, and, not intently, the way you see things that are directly in your line of sight when you're pretending to look elsewhere. 34, maybe 35. Broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from serious training over serious years. And he wore his black belt, the way some men wore expensive watches, not for warmth, but for what it said about them. He was technically good. She could see that in the first 5 minutes. His footwork was clean, and his demonstrations were precise. When he moved, he knew what he was doing. But there was a but. She watched him stop a drill to correct Avery, the same young man from the mat, and the correction was accurate. The technique was genuinely wrong, and Briggs was right about why, but the way he said it. In front of everyone, drawing it out, making sure the room witnessed that he had seen the error before he explained it. And the correction wasn't for Avery, it was for the audience. She knew that teaching style. She'd encountered it before, in different gyms, in different years, and instructors who taught from the chest, and instructors who taught from the ego, and the difference was immediately visible if you'd spent enough time in rooms like this one. Briggs Holloway taught from the ego. That wasn't unusual. And plenty of people like that produced technically skilled fighters. But the cost was specific. The students in that room were getting better because they were afraid of being visibly bad in front of him, and not because they loved what they were learning. Not the same thing. She went back to her phone. Caleb came off the floor at 7:45, towel around his neck, still catching his breath. He spotted Nadine and walked over, and she saw it then, the green belt, and knew since last week. There'd been a test she hadn't known about. She opened her mouth, then didn't say what she'd been about to say, smiled instead. "Green belt," she said, and he shrugged, which with Caleb meant he was pleased and didn't want a production made of it. "You worked for that," she said. He sat in the chair beside her and drank from his water bottle. She would ask about the test format on the way home, and right now she let him have his water and his breath. That was the particular rhythm they had, and it worked because she respected it. That was when the woman sat down on her other side, and 50s, gray at her temples. She carried herself the way women carried themselves when they'd spent decades not apologizing for the space they occupied. She sat with easy authority and put her phone on the chair arm between them without preamble. Face up, screen on, and Nadine looked at it, a sports website, years old, and the photograph, and a woman in fighting stance, and mid-celebration, and gloves raised, and mouth guard still in, and a crowd exploding behind her. and the headline, Nadine the Ghost Web, 3-time world champion steps away after family tragedy. And Nadine looked at the screen, then looked back at her own phone. The woman Carol Tate, who had a son in the intermediate class and had been sitting in this waiting area twice a week for 8 months, didn't say a word, didn't ask anything, and she simply let the article sit there between them the way you set something down in front of someone without requiring them to pick it up. On the main floor, Briggs was running a final drill, and he had Avery on the mat again. The correction this time carried across the whole room. Carol watched. Nadine watched. Neither of them spoke. After a minute, Carol picked up her phone and put it in her bag. Nadine exhaled slowly. That was a kindness. She recognized it as one. And the specific kindness of someone who had seen something and chosen not to make it into a moment. She stood to go find Caleb's jacket, which he'd left on a hook near the door. And as she passed the partition edge, Briggs Holloway looked up from the drill. He saw her, and something shifted in the room before either of them said a word. He didn't move toward her immediately. He finished the drill, sent students to cool down, and took a long drink from his water bottle. Then crossed the floor in the unhurried way of a man who believed any room he walked through became his room by the act of walking through it. And Nadine had Caleb's jacket in her hand. She was orienting toward the exit. "You're Caleb's mom," Briggs said. "Not a question." "That's right," she said. "Good kid." He said it like a gift he was offering. "Hard worker." "He is." And she felt the assessment happening the way he looked at her, at the jacket and the boots and the absence of anything designed to impress. Recalibrating, deciding what she was. "You ever train?" he asked, casual. "No, really." He tilted his head. "And because you moved fast back there. With Avery. Anybody would have moved." Actually, his tone shifted, not much, just slightly. "Most people don't. Most people freeze." She didn't respond. "I run a parent orientation," he said. "Free. And so parents understand what their kids are actually learning, what real training looks like." He paused. "Might be useful." "I appreciate that." She picked up her bag. "Caleb, ready?" And Caleb appeared from the back and looked between the two adults with the careful reading of a young man who'd learned to notice when rooms changed temperature, and they left. She didn't say anything on the walk to the truck. Caleb didn't either. They drove home with the radio filling the space between them, and she didn't think about Briggs Holloway. She thought about the article on Carol Tate's phone, the photograph, and the woman in that photograph with her gloves raised and her mouth guard still in looked like someone Nadine used to know. Someone she had been in a life that existed before paint-stained jeans and Thursday pickups, and a door at the end of the hall that stayed locked. And she turned the radio up slightly, drove home. The following Thursday, she went back. She told herself it was just for Caleb, which was true, mostly true. She sat in the same chair, same wall, same phone. And Carol Tate arrived 11 minutes after Nadine and sat in the chair beside her without ceremony. Like they had an arrangement. They did not have an arrangement. This was just what was happening now. "You came back," Carol said quietly. "Picking up my son," Nadine said, and Carol smiled without showing it much. Didn't push. On the floor, Briggs was running advanced combinations, technical session transitions, counters, the kind of work that required years of foundation before it clicked. She watched without looking like she was watching, and she'd had a lot of practice at this too. Avery was on the floor, trying hard, making visible mistakes, which happened when you tried hard without having the foundation yet. Briggs corrected him twice in 20 minutes, both accurate, and both too long, both aimed at the room rather than at Avery. She watched Avery absorb the precision and reset quickly, watched him absorb the second and reset slower, something going out of his posture by a degree or two. Not defeat. More like a candle turned down, and she knew that feeling from a specific age and a specific room. Some lessons teach you the technique, some teach you something else entirely. The second kind stayed longer. Caleb came off the floor at break and got water and glanced at her on his way past. She gave him a small nod. He nodded back. "Good." Briggs clocked the exchange. She could tell even from across the room the way his attention moved briefly to the waiting area, to her, then back to his students, just for a second, and she kept her eyes on her phone. After the second session, Briggs crossed the floor again. He sat in the empty chair 2 spots down from Carol, friendly, open, and his gym, his chairs, his ease. Ms. Webb. He'd corrected himself from the first time. "Briggs," she said. "The offer still stands. The parent orientation." He looked at the floor the way people looked at things that weren't there when they wanted to seem casual, and gives you context for what Caleb's working on. I have context, she said. A small pause. He wasn't used to that word coming back at him with weight behind it. Do you train anywhere? He tried. And no. Used to? She looked up at him then. Not long, just enough. Why do you ask? He held the look. The way you moved with Avery. Last week, that wasn't reflex. He paused. I've been doing this a long time. I can usually tell. I caught someone who was falling, she said. That's all. And he studied her for a moment. Something adjusting behind his eyes. I think it might be useful, he said, for you to come on the mat. And just a few minutes. Basic movement. A lot of parents find it helpful to understand. No, thank you. Final. He absorbed it. Nodded once. Took a drink. Looked at the floor. No pressure, he said. She went back to her phone. He went back to the floor, and Carol Tate shifted slightly in her chair. Neither woman said anything. Third Thursday, Caleb had a bruised rib from sparring, and checked, not serious, and he was going to keep training, and which she respected even as the fact of it sat in her chest like a coin someone had pressed there, and she drove him to the gym. This time she didn't debate going in. She just went in, sat down. Carol arrived. They nodded. By now, this was its own kind of routine, which was strange because neither of them had ever agreed to it out loud. And on the floor, Briggs was drilling takedown defense. She watched Avery attempt the same counter 3 times, and each time she saw exactly what was wrong. His weight was too far back. When the grab came, he had no base to work from, and she kept this observation entirely inside her own head, which was where it belonged. Caleb was on the far side of the floor. The bruised rib was slowing him slightly, but his form stayed clean, and she watched him move and felt the complicated pride that lived in a specific part of her chest, the kind reserved for things that had cost something to build. She was almost settled. Almost. Briggs came off the floor at the halfway break. He didn't sit beside her this time, and he stood in front of the waiting area. Not aggressive, just positioned, at a volume that carried to every corner of the room. And you know, he said, and pleasantly, and to no one in particular. And one thing I always tell parents, he looked at her, is that martial arts is something you have to feel. And reading about swimming is not swimming. She looked at her phone. I'd like to make an offer. His voice opened up, drew the room in, and Ms. Webb. 5 minutes on the mat. Nothing serious. Basic movement. He smiled at the other parents. Think of it as a demonstration. Show everyone what real training looks like compared to, he paused watching from the outside. Watching from the outside, and she heard Carol go still beside her. I appreciate the offer, Nadine said. No. Come on, lighter now, almost amused. What's the worst that happens? You learn something. No. Still pleasant. Still the phone. Briggs let a beat sit. And then, hey, Caleb. Her jaw tightened. 1 millimeter. Caleb looked up from where he'd been filling his water bottle. Your mom's nervous. Still the friendly voice. The coaching voice. That's okay. Not everyone's built for this. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't look at his mother, and that was the thing. He didn't look at her. Not out of shame. She knew her son. He wasn't ashamed of her. He was 20 years old, and he was on a training floor, and an adult had just used him as a tool, and he was still processing what that meant and what the right response was. But he didn't look at her. And that was the thing Briggs had counted on. Probably without fully knowing he was counting on it. The specific gap between a parent and a child in a public space. The particular weight of being seen a certain way by your own kid. And Nadine set her phone down, carefully. The way you set something down when your hands need to be empty for what comes next. She stood up. She took off her jacket and folded it, set it on the chair. She was wearing a plain gray long-sleeve shirt. Her arms were visible. Lean and defined in the way that work made them, or the other thing, the thing that used to be her life. She looked at Briggs Holloway. One condition, she said. He blinked, and he had not prepared for a condition. He'd expected hesitation or compliance or a flustered kind of yes. Not this. When this is over, she said, you apologize to your students, and not to me. She paused, for using this moment as entertainment instead of teaching. Several people shifted. A student near the edge of the floor looked at the mat. Briggs smiled, but the shape of it had changed. Deal, he said, if this goes the way I think it will, and she looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the mat. She stood in the center, under her feet, the give and density of training mat. The particular quality of it, the way it took your weight and gave it back. And she hadn't felt this surface in 14 years. Her body didn't care about the 14 years. Her body had been keeping notes the entire time. That was what no one ever told you about that kind of training. And not the dramatic stuff, not the championships, or the records, or the highlight footage that could go on a television screen. What they didn't tell you was that your nervous system archived everything, and every hour of drilling, and every counter, and every combination until the combinations stopped being thought and became something else, something that lived below thought, and in the place where breathing lived and balance lived, and the knowledge of where your weight was at every moment of every movement, and she hadn't asked for it back. It had apparently never left. She stood still. She breathed. She let the mat remember her feet. Around the room, the atmosphere had changed without anyone deciding to change it. Students who'd been moving stopped moving, and the other parents had put their phones away. Carol Tate sat very straight with her hands folded in her lap, her expression impossible to read. Caleb stood near the water cooler. He was watching. He had never seen this, and he had no frame for what he was about to see. He had a mother who painted houses and drove a 2009 Ford with a heater that didn't work properly on the passenger side, and read the newspaper in the morning, and made good rice, and never, not once in his 20 years, and had given him any reason to know what she looked like, standing in the center of a training mat. And Briggs rolled his shoulders, bounced on his toes, and did the small pre-movement energy display that fighters use to signal to a room that something was about to happen. Nadine stood completely still. She was watching his weight distribution, the micro shift of his shoulders before he committed to a direction, and the way his right heel came up slightly when he was preparing to generate power, the tell in his left shoulder that preceded his dominant technique. All of it downloading into the part of her brain that had been asleep for 14 years, and was now, without drama, simply awake. And, ready? Briggs asked. Yes, she said. Her voice was level. That was the first thing that changed in the room. Not her stance, not her movement, her voice. The absolute lack of performance in it. No nerves, no bravado, no awareness of the audience. And she'd said yes, the way you said yes to a simple question that had a simple answer. And it unsettled people. She could feel it. The way a room changed when something didn't behave, the way the room had decided it would behave. And Briggs came forward. Now here is what none of them knew yet. Not Briggs. Not the students along the edges, not the parents who had stopped looking at their phones, not Carol Tate sitting straight in her chair, and not even Caleb, who was watching his mother with an expression that had no name yet. What they didn't know was that Nadine Webb had once been Nadine the Ghost Webb, that she had competed professionally from age 20 to 28, and that she had a record of 22 wins and 0 losses, and that she had held the world title in her weight class for 4 consecutive years. That she had been called the Ghost, not because she was quiet though she was, but because opponents reported the same thing after fighting her. That she was never quite where you aimed. And what they didn't know was that she had walked away from all of it in 2010. Not from injury, not from defeat, not because the opportunity dried up or the body gave out, and she walked away because of 5 minutes. And because of a night when she stood in the center of a very different floor, and in a very different city, and gloves raised, and belt in her hands, and the crowd at a volume that went through your body rather than into your ears, and her phone started ringing. She'd left it with her corner. She didn't answer it. She was in the middle of the best night of her life, and her phone was ringing, and she did not answer it. And she found out what the calls were about 22 minutes later. Jerome Webb, 26 years old, her younger brother, and the person who had taught her the first takedown she ever learned, and in their father's garage, and on a mat made of taped-together foam pieces, and under a bare bulb that swung slightly when the AC unit kicked on, and Jerome, who had been at every fight, who had driven to the championship that night, who had been 12 miles from the arena when a car ran a red light, and 9:47 p.m. Nadine raised the belt, 9:52 p.m. Jerome was gone 5 minutes. She had spent 14 years carrying the arithmetic of that. The way those two events lived inside the same evening and could not be separated from each other. And winning always tasted like losing. Losing always felt like her fault, even though it wasn't, even though she knew in every rational part of herself that it wasn't. She knew it wasn't. She was still working on fully believing that. But standing here right now, this wasn't about any of that. This was about Caleb standing by the water cooler, not looking at her. This was about a man who thought he knew what she was because of what she looked like. This was about 14 years of choosing visibility and what it felt like to finally stop. She stood in the center of the mat. She breathed. Briggs came forward, and the rest of the story began. And Briggs Holloway had never lost in front of his own students. Not once. Not in 8 years of running this gym. Not in the 3 years before that when he was competing. Not in any room he had ever walked into and decided was his. That was the thing about Briggs. And he didn't just believe he was the best person in any given space. He had evidence, consistent, reputable, documented evidence. Students who had come to him unable to throw a proper jab and left with regional titles, and a win record that held up, a reputation in this city that meant something. He was skilled. That part was real, and nobody in that room would have argued it. He came forward with a jab, fast, technically clean, and the kind of jab thrown not to end something, but to establish range and test response. A professional's opening move. He was done performing. And something had shifted in him the moment she said yes in that voice, that flat, unimpressed, completely unafraid yes, and now he actually wanted to know what he was dealing with. And Nadine wasn't there, not where he aimed. She moved her head, just her head, 3 inches to the left. The jab passed close enough that she felt the displaced air against her cheek. She didn't move her feet, she looked at him. Briggs reset that hadn't happened before, and not like that. Not with someone who'd been sitting in a folding chair for the past hour reading her phone. He recalibrated. Told himself it was reaction time, pure instinct. Anyone could have a fast head slip on a single jab. And he threw a cross. She slipped it. Same economy. Same patience, like she had already made a decision about where she was going before his shoulder even rotated. He threw a hook. She rolled under it. Not backward, not sideways, under, and. Like the hook was an obstacle at a fixed height, and she simply passed beneath it, smooth and unhurried and entirely unbothered. She still hadn't moved her feet more than 6 inches in any direction. She was standing in almost the exact spot where she'd started, and along the edges of the floor the students had gone completely still. A few of them had their mouths open without being aware of it. And Avery Sutton, standing near the equipment rack with a water bottle in his hand, had stopped drinking and was gripping the rack beside him without knowing he was doing it. Briggs changed approach. Okay, she was fast, and she'd trained somewhere, clearly more than community center self-defense classes. Fine. He had more tools than combinations, and he was not a man who panicked in difficult moments. And he was a man who had been in difficult moments and come out the other side, which was why he had a black belt and a gym with his name on the window. He feinted high and went low, a front kick to the midsection, and sharp, powerful, and meant to push her back and create space he could work with, and establish that he could control distance, make her move on his terms. And she caught his foot, one hand on the outside of his ankle, and clean and immediate and without any visible effort, she held it, 1 second. Then she let it go. She didn't throw him, didn't sweep his base leg, and didn't do anything with the grip except hold it long enough for every single person in that room to understand exactly what she was communicating. I could have done something here. I chose not to, and she released his ankle and stepped back and stood there, hands loose at her sides, looking at him with the expression of someone waiting for the next question on a test they had already taken. And Briggs put his foot down. His face had changed. Not fear, not yet. The thing that lived just before fear, when your body starts performing calculations that your pride hasn't caught up with and won't be catching up with anytime soon. His shoulders were tight, and he could feel the beginning of the overhead that came when a fight wasn't resolving the way every fight before it had resolved. He had thrown 11 techniques. She had avoided every one of them with what appeared to be the physical's effort of someone getting up from a couch. And she was breathing normally. He was not. He breathed. He reset. He thought about what he knew and what he was working with. She could slip punches all night. She had fast hands and faster reading. Fine. That was fine. He'd dealt with slippery fighters before, and the answer was always the same. Take them down. Get them on the mat where their feet didn't matter and their head movement didn't matter. And size and strength and wrestling background did matter. And he was a wrestler first, before the MMA, before the black belt, before this gym, 3 years on a college wrestling team. That was where his body understood itself best. The clinch, the level change, the control of another person's weight through leverage and timing. He had taken down bigger, stronger, more experienced fighters than this woman in a gray shirt and work boots. He would take her down. Then they would both know where things stood. He set his feet, and he feinted with a jab. She moved for it, just slightly. The first time she'd moved anticipatorily rather than reactively, and he shot, double leg, both arms driving for the backs of her thighs. And his level change was fast and explosive, the kind that came from thousands of repetitions, and a body that knew this movement the way it knew breathing. And his momentum was full and forward, and he had caught bigger people than her with this shot and put them on the mat. And that was what was about to happen. And except she stepped into it. This was the moment, not dramatic, not loud, no crash, no shout, no impact that shook the floor. And just a thing that happened that the human brain refused for a split second before accepting, because it was so fundamentally contrary to what everyone in that room had prepared themselves to see. She stepped into his shot. One step, and her left foot forward, her center dropping at exactly the same moment, her weight accepting his momentum instead of colliding with it, and her left hand found the back of his head, not grabbing, and not wrenching, and barely touching, and just there. And her right hand found his far shoulder, and she redirected him. That was the only word for it. She took everything he had sent at her, all the force and speed and forward drive of a legitimate wrestling shot from a trained athlete, and she borrowed it, turned it, and sent it down and forward and to the side, into a path that he had not planned and could not correct for, because his entire body was already committed to a direction that no longer existed. And Jerome Zome's move, "Don't fight the force, Nadine. Borrow it." Briggs hit the mat. Not hard. That was what nobody expected. She hadn't slammed him, hadn't driven him down with her weight, hadn't punished him on the way, and he hit the mat with his own force, returned to him. His own momentum, completing a trajectory that she had simply adjusted, face down, hands flat. The sound of it, that specific thud of a body finding the floor it didn't expect to find, went through the gym like a bell being struck. And then silence. Not the silence of people holding their breath. Deeper than that. The silence of people who had just seen something they did not have the vocabulary for yet and needed a moment to find it. Nadine stood. One step back from where Briggs lay. Her breathing was even, and she was looking at the far wall. Not at him, not at the students, not at the parents. And the far wall. And the way you looked at something when you were not in the room with everyone else but in a different room, and an older one, and lit differently. And she was in a garage. She was 20 years old. The bulb above her was swinging slightly because the AC unit had just kicked on and the chain hung loose, and every time the AC started the bulb moved. And Jerome was across from her on the mat they'd made from 4 foam pieces that never quite lined up right. And he was saying it again because she'd gotten it wrong again, and he would say it as many times as it took. And don't fight the force, borrow it. His momentum is your momentum if you stop trying to stop it. She blinked. Came back to the room. Briggs was pushing himself up on his forearms, slowly, and not because he was hurt, she'd made certain he wasn't, but because the body needed a moment when the mind was processing something it hadn't prepared for. He was stunned in the way that had nothing to do with physical impact, and stunned in the way that happened when the story a person had built about themselves, and carefully, and over years, and turned out to have a chapter they had never read. And he looked at his own hands on the mat. He looked at the space where she had been when he shot. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Avery Sutton set his water bottle down. He had been standing near the equipment rack since before the sparring started. He had watched the whole thing. He had watched Briggs throw 11 techniques and find nothing. He had watched Nadine catch Briggs's foot and hold it and let it go. He had watched the takedown, and he was 21 years old. He had been training at Iron Fist for 8 months. And in those 8 months, he had been corrected in front of the group more times than he'd counted. And each correction had been technically accurate, and each one had been delivered in a way that made him feel smaller than the mistake he'd made. And he was the youngest in the advanced class. Briggs reminded him of this when it was useful, and never when it wasn't. And he had known about Nadine Webb since last Thursday. He had known the moment she caught him the grip, the redirect, the placement of her hand on his arm that felt nothing like a parent's panicked grab. He had gone home that night and sat with it and thought about what he'd felt in that half second. Then he'd done what 21-year-olds did when they felt something they couldn't explain. He searched, not her name. He didn't know her name, and he searched the movement, the way she'd caught him, the angle and the economy of it, and the specific technique of the redirect. He found a category. He found a style. He found the fighters associated with that style at the highest level in the period that her hands suggested. And then he found her. He had watched every video he could find over the following week. 3 championship fights. Training footage from 2008 that someone had uploaded to a platform that barely existed anymore, and an interview she'd given before the 2010 title fight, where she said almost nothing of consequence in the most composed way he had ever seen anyone deflect questions. He had kept all of this to himself. He had not been sure what to do with it. Now he knew, and he walked to the gym's television, the flat screen on the wall they used for training footage and championship replays. And he had his phone in his hand and the cable in his other hand, and he connected them without asking anyone's permission, because sometimes you didn't ask permission. Sometimes you just did the thing that needed doing, and he pressed play, the screen filled with footage, time-stamped, competitions from 2007 through 2010. A fighter in black and red, moving through opponents with the same terrible patience the room had just watched Briggs experience firsthand, and combinations that ended fights cleanly. A counter in the second round of the 2008 title defense that the commentators talked over each other to describe, and the 2009 championship highlight a takedown reversal from the bottom position that the broadcast team called one of the cleanest technical executions they had seen at that level in years, and under the footage in the network's graphics from that era, Nadine the Ghost Webb. 3-time world MMAC champion, record 22-0, and below that in smaller text, the line that had appeared at the end of every piece of coverage from late 2010 onward, retired 2010. Personal reasons. The room watched the footage, 20 seconds of it. 30, and the particular quality of watching someone on a screen, and then looking at that same person, standing 8 feet away, and understanding that the screen is not a different person, and that the person on the screen and the person on the mat are continuous, and that the 14 years between then and now are real, but they are not a transformation, and they are just time. And then the room looked at Nadine. She hadn't moved. She was still in the same spot, arms loose, work boots on the mat, gray shirt. The expression on her face was not triumph, not satisfaction, and not any of the things a person looked like when they had just proven something to someone who needed proving to. She looked like someone who had just put something down that she had been carrying for a long time. Just for a moment. Just briefly. And like setting a bag down on a bench and feeling the weight leave your shoulders and standing there for a second before you had to pick it back up. Caleb Webb was standing by the water cooler. He had been there since Briggs went down. He watched the footage on the screen. He watched his mother on the mat. He looked at the screen again. The woman on the screen was 26, 27, 28 years old, and her face was the same face and not the same face, something in it more open, or maybe just less guarded, the way a face looked before it learned to keep its own counsel, but her hands. He watched her hands in the footage and felt something move through him that he didn't have a word for yet. He knew those hands. He had watched those hands his entire life, spreading drop cloths on a client's floor, cutting vegetables at the kitchen counter, and folding laundry with the particular efficiency of someone who didn't waste motion, wrapping around a coffee mug in the mornings. And last month she had sat across from him in the kitchen and shown him a takedown counter and said it was basic wrestling, shown him the hand placement, the step, the hip position, drilled it with him slowly on the living room floor until he had the shape of it. He looked at his own hands. He looked at his mother. He understood what he was looking at, and he didn't understand all of it yet. There was more underneath than what was visible. He could feel that, the way you felt depth in water, even when you couldn't see the bottom. But he understood enough. His mother was looking at the far wall again. Not the screen, not him, the wall. And he understood, standing by the water cooler in his training gear, with a bruised rib and a green belt, and 20 years of Sunday dinners and quiet drives, and a door he had never been allowed to open. He understood that she was somewhere else right now, briefly, and in a room he had never been shown. He was going to ask to be shown it tonight, and he didn't know yet if she would say yes. He thought maybe tonight was the night she might. Briggs stood up. He took his time with it, and, not because anything was damaged, she had been precise about that, and he registered it dimly even in the middle of the processing, and that she had put him on the mat without hurting him, and that the control required to do that to someone your size with someone. His momentum was in itself a statement, but because standing up quickly would have been performance, and there had been enough performance in this room already tonight, and he stood, brushed his hands on his gi pants, straightened. He looked at the screen, watched the last 20 seconds of footage, and watched the woman in black and red move through a championship fight with the same quality he had just experienced, that stillness that preceded every movement, that total absence of wasted energy. Then he looked at the woman standing on his mat. Same person, and he had invited this woman to demonstrate in front of his students. He had used her son's name to make her comply when she'd declined twice, and he had called her nervous. He had set this up as entertainment. He turned off the television. He stood with his back to the room for a moment, the back of a man who was doing something in private that he needed a few seconds for. Then he turned around, and he looked at his students first, not at Nadine, his students, and the faces he saw twice a week, and the ones he'd been teaching and correcting and building, and he's understood now with the clarity that came from being handed something you hadn't asked for, and occasionally diminishing in ways he'd been telling himself were pedagogical. And 20-something-year-old Avery Sutton, who had just put a video on the television without asking permission, because he was 21 and believed in something strongly enough to act on it without a guarantee it would land right. He looked at all of them. "And I owe you an apology," he said. Quiet, not his teaching voice, not his floor voice, just his voice, stripped of the room. "What I did tonight wasn't a lesson." He paused. "I brought Ms. Webb onto this mat to make a point in front of an audience, and I used her son's name when she said no twice." He stopped. "That's not instruction. That's ego using the word instruction as a costume." He looked at the mat. "You deserve better than that from someone who's supposed to be teaching you what this is actually about." He looked up, and he looked at Nadine. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. No performance in them. No audience awareness. Just 2 words from a man who had just met himself somewhere he didn't like, and was choosing, in front of everyone, to acknowledge it. And Nadine looked at him. She held the look for a moment, reading it. She'd seen enough performed apology to know this wasn't that. And this had the texture of something real, something that had cost him in the currency that mattered most to men like Briggs, which was the image they maintained in front of people they wanted to impress. "Thank you," she said, and she turned and picked up her jacket from the chair where she'd left it, put it on, and looked for Caleb. He was already moving toward her from the water cooler. They met in the middle of the floor, in front of everyone, and she looked at his face, and he looked at hers, and she could see the questions there, and arranged in a kind of order, and patient and waiting, and the way Caleb had always been patient when it mattered, and he didn't ask any of them out loud. "Not here. Let's go home," she said. He nodded. They walked out together, and behind them the gym was quiet in a way it hadn't been in a long time. Not uncomfortable quiet. The other kind. The kind that settled after something real had happened, and people were still in the presence of it, and nobody wanted to break it yet. And Avery Sutton stood by the television. He didn't move for a moment. Then he sat down on the edge of the mat and stared at the floor and thought about a lot of things. The way you thought about a lot of things when someone showed you something you hadn't known you needed to see. And they drove in silence for 11 minutes. She'd turned the radio off without thinking. Both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road. The quiet between them was the fullest quiet they had shared in 20 years of being mother and son. Not empty quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, and the quiet of 2 people who were both holding something significant, and neither of them wanted to drop it by talking about the wrong thing first. Caleb looked out the passenger window, and a gas station, a closed laundromat, a street lamp with a flicker in it that had probably been flickering for months, he said. The room at the end of the hall. She breathed. "Yes," she said. "That's where it is," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly, still looking out the window. "And tonight," he said. Not a question. She thought about it. 4 blocks worth of thinking. "Tonight," she said. He turned and looked at her then. She felt it on the side of her face the way she used to feel the attention of a full arena, specific and total and waiting. And she kept her eyes on the road. She kept breathing. She told herself she was ready. She was almost ready. She had been almost ready for 14 years, and she was going to have to do it before ready arrived, because ready, she had learned, was not a place you reached, and it was a thing you decided. She turned onto their street. She parked. She sat in the truck for a moment after the engine went off. Caleb waited. She got out, and he got out. They went inside. She walked straight to the end of the hall. She didn't stop to take her jacket off or her boots off. She didn't give herself time for the pause to become a reason to wait one more day. And the key was on the separate ring she kept in the bedside table drawer. Not her main keys, a separate ring with one key on it, which was its own kind of statement about what the room meant. And she went and got it, came back to the door. She had stood in front of this door with this key twice in 14 years. And both times she had stood there long enough to know she was going to unlock it, and then not unlocked it, and put the key back in the drawer, and gone to bed, and lain there with the ceiling and the water stain that looked like the state of Florida. This was the third time, and she put the key in, turned it, pushed the door open, reached inside for the light switch. The room filled with light. Caleb stood in the doorway, and she watched him look at the room the way you watched. Someone look at something you had been keeping hidden, not with your own eyes on the thing, but with your eyes on the person seeing it for the first time. He didn't speak. He was taking inventory. She could see it, and the methodical, quiet attention that was one of the things she most recognized of herself in him. Along the back wall, on simple hooks, 3 championship belts, not display cases, not presentation mounts, and just belts on hooks, the way you hung tools you respected but didn't need to perform respect for. Black leather, gold plates, 2007, 2008, 2010, newspaper clippings framed on the wall beside them, 8 or 9, not all of them, and just the ones that had mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with what they said. And on the shelf below, a shoebox, a manila envelope, a folder of papers. On the desk in the corner, a pair of boxing gloves, old, red leather gone soft from years of use, men's medium, the kind you bought on sale because they worked and the brand didn't matter. And Caleb walked into the room. He stopped in front of the belts, looked at 2007, 2008, moved to 2010. There's no 2009, he said. I didn't compete in 2009, she said. And I had you in 2009. He turned and looked at her. Something moved through his face that she didn't try to name. You won the last one after I was born, he said. You were 8 months old. He looked back at the belts. She sat down in the chair at the desk, and the chair she had put in this room and never sat in. It creaked. It was slightly dusty. She sat in it like she had earned it, which she supposed she had, one way or another. And the gloves, Caleb said. He was looking at them, not touching. Looking. Jerome's, she said. He turned fully then, looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that she had been looking at for 20 years and that still, sometimes, reminded her of a person who was not in this room. And sit down, she said. He sat on the edge of the desk. She told him about Jerome, all of it, and the version she had never told anyone, and not a therapist, and not Carol Tate, and not Coach Ray, and not Caleb's father in the years when she still told him things, and the version that went all the way back. Jerome Webb had been born 2 years after Nadine. Younger, but from the time they were old enough to figure out how the world worked, he'd operated like her older brother. The one who cleared space for her, and the one who believed before she did. When Nadine was 17 and started getting serious about training, Jerome was 15 and already the most attentive student in any room she was in. He watched every session he could get to, and he asked questions she hadn't thought to ask. He remembered things her coaches said that she forgot. He was good himself, genuinely talented. He could have competed. He chose not to. She used to ask him why, and he always said the same thing, and said he didn't have the temperament for it, and meaning he didn't have whatever it was that let a person be violent professionally, and not as performance, and not as job, and not as identity. And he had the physical capability, and he just wasn't built for the intention behind it. So he was everything else instead. He was the one who found Coach Ray, who drove her to the first real gym when they didn't have money for buses, and who stayed in the car for 3-hour training sessions because he didn't want her to wait after, and who called her after every fight, and win or loss, and then talked about the technique before anything else, because he knew that was what she needed, and not the result, and the understanding of what had happened and why. And he was there for every fight, every single one. He never missed. Until the last one, she stopped. She was looking at his gloves on the desk. He was driving to the arena, she said. He'd had car trouble during the day, and a friend dropped him at a rental place, but it took longer than expected and he was running behind. She paused. I didn't know any of that until after. Caleb was very still. I won in the 4th round, she said, and unanimous decision. They gave me the belt on the mat. The crowd was she stopped. Found the right word. It was everything. The loudest I'd ever heard, and I remember standing there thinking that Jerome was going to lose his mind. He always lost his mind when I won, and he'd be somewhere in that arena right now losing his mind, and I was going to find him after. She stopped. He wasn't in the arena, she said. Caleb breathed once, and 9:47, and they gave me the belt, and, she said, and 9:52, a car ran a red light and hit Jerome's rental on the driver's side. 12 miles from where I was standing. The room was quiet. My corner manager came to tell me. I was still in my gear, still had my hand wraps on, and he kept saying your brother and I kept not processing it, because Jerome was supposed to be in that building. Jerome was always in that building. There was no version of that night in my head where Jerome wasn't in that building, and Caleb said nothing. She was grateful for that. I walked away the week after, she said. No interviews, no statement. I called Coach Ray and I told him I was done. He said he'd wait for me to change my mind. I told him not to wait. She looked up at her son, and she looked at Jerome's gloves. And I came here, she said, changed my number, started over, and I never went back. Caleb was quiet for a moment, and then he said, until tonight. She thought about that. I didn't fight tonight, she said. She stopped. Looked for the distinction. I let something out that I'd been keeping in. That's not the same as going back. He considered this. Is it different? He said. And she thought about it honestly, which meant sitting with it for a moment without arriving at the comfortable answer first. A little, she said. He looked at her, and then he said the thing she hadn't known she needed to hear, and not the question she'd been bracing for, not the reproach or the grief or the why didn't you tell me that she'd imagined on the drive home. He said, I knew the takedown wasn't basic wrestling. She looked at him. He said, you showed me last month, and you said it was something you'd picked up. But I've been in this gym for 2 years, and Briggs never showed us anything close to it. I knew you'd learned it somewhere real, and I just didn't know. He looked at the gloves. That was Jerome's, wasn't it? Not a question. Her throat closed. She nodded back. They sat like that, in the room that had been locked for 14 years, and under the light she'd only turned on twice before without being able to stay. And with 3 belts on hooks, and a pair of red gloves and a shoebox she wasn't ready for yet, and a folder of papers, and a son who was looking at his dead uncle's boxing gloves with the same dark, steady eyes she saw in her mirror every morning. And after a while he said, you're not angry at yourself anymore. She looked at him. How do you know, she said. Because you're in this room, he said, and you're not leaving, she breathed. She looked at the gloves. I'm working on it, she said. He nodded. That's enough, he said. And she didn't know if he meant for now or in general. She thought maybe both. The shoebox sat on the desk. She'd left it there after the night she opened the room, and not put it back on the shelf, not moved it to another surface, just left it on the desk where Caleb had been sitting, in the same spot for 4 days. And every morning she walked past the open door, the door she had also left open, which was its own kind of decision, and she could see the shoebox from the hallway. Brown cardboard, worn at the corner, and a brand that didn't exist anymore, for a shoe she hadn't owned since her mid-20s, and she kept meaning to open it. She kept making coffee instead. That was the thing about the last sealed thing. The belts she'd uncovered, the gloves she'd looked at while she talked, and the newspaper clippings she'd let Caleb read in silence while she sat in the chair and watched him read. All of that had moved, had loosened, had become, in the space of one night, something she could be in the same room with without the room shrinking. The shoebox was different, and the shoebox was the part she hadn't been ready for in 2010, and hadn't been ready for in the years that followed, and was possibly, maybe, beginning to be ready for now. Possibly. The possibly was doing a lot of work. She poured her coffee, and she stood at the kitchen window. She did not open the shoebox, not yet. The call from Coach Ray Simmons came on a Saturday morning. She was in the middle of taping window trim in a client's dining room, and blue tape along the edge, her hands moving in the automatic rhythm of work she had done enough times that her mind could be elsewhere, while her hands stayed precise. She was thinking about Caleb, about the night in the room, and about the way he had said that's enough, and whether he had meant it as permission or as assessment. Her phone buzzed on the drop cloth beside the paint can. She picked it up without looking, expecting the client, and expecting Caleb, expecting possibly Reeves Harmon calling from a different number because she had blocked the first two. She looked at the screen, and the name was there in her contacts exactly as she had entered it 12 years ago, and when she still had it, and when she kept it without knowing why, and when deleting it would have felt like something she wasn't ready to do, and keeping it felt like something she wasn't ready to use. And Coach Ray. She held the phone, and she answered. "Ray," she said, "Nadine." His voice came through unchanged in the ways that mattered. Lower, yes, slower. The particular deliberateness of a man in his 60s who had learned that words moved better when you didn't rush them, but the same voice that had talked her through round corners and the weeks before title fights, and the worst conversation of her life in a locker room in a city she could still not drive through without the weight of it settling on her chest. "And I saw the video," he said. "I figured," she said. "How are you?" She looked at the blue tape on the trim, the clean edge she'd been making. "I'm all right," she said. "You look all right?" He paused. "You looked like yourself, the real one." She didn't say anything to that, and the real one was something Ray had said to her once before, years ago, after a fight where she'd been tentative in the second round, and then found something in the third that changed the whole complexion of it. And he'd said, "You found the real one in there." She'd known what he meant. She'd never fully explained it to anyone who wasn't him. "That takedown," he said. She waited. "That was Jerome's move," he said. Her chest did the thing it did, the compression, and brief and total, like something being pressed from outside. "Yeah," she said. "He was quiet for a moment. He would have lost his mind," Ray said. "And he would have called me at midnight, and I would have answered because it was Jerome. And he would have said, 'Did you see her?' And I would have said, 'Yes, I saw her.' And we would have talked about it for 2 hours because that was what Jerome did when you did something right." And she closed her eyes. "He would have," she said. Ray was quiet again, the comfortable quiet of someone who had known you long enough to understand which silences needed filling and which ones didn't. "I'm not calling to ask you to come back," he said. "Good," she said, "and I know better than that by now. You should." "I'm calling," he said, "because I wanted to hear your voice." A pause. "And because I wanted to tell you something I should have said a long time ago and kept thinking there would be a better for, and there never was, so here it is." And she waited. "What you built after," said, "the quiet and the work and the raising that boy. That's a whole career. It doesn't have a scoreboard, but it's a whole career, and I don't think you've ever let yourself count it as one." And she stood in the client's dining room with the phone against her ear, and the blue tape on the trim and the drop cloths on the floor, and the particular smell of a room about to be repainted, and her eyes were stinging. She was not going to cry in a client's dining room on a Saturday morning. She breathed. "Thank you, Ray," she said. "You take care of yourself, I will." She put the phone back on the drop cloth. She's picked up the tape. She finished the trim, and her hands were steady the whole time. The Iron Fist gym situation moved in ways she hadn't anticipated and had not asked for. By Tuesday, the gym's parent company had received formal complaints from 4 different parents, and not about the sparring, not about the video, about the promotion test, about a 20-year-old young man standing on the mat being told in front of everyone that he had barely met the minimum standard and should consider himself fortunate for the leniency being extended to him. And she had not filed a complaint. She hadn't even thought about filing a complaint. That wasn't what Thursday had been about for her. Carol Tate had filed one, and 3 other parents had done the same, independently and without coordinating, which said something about how long this had been sitting, and she found out from Carol on Wednesday morning. A text, brief and factual in the way Carol communicated everything. They pulled his promotion authority. 60-day review. Thought you should know. Then, after a pause, Avery Sutton asked me to pass along that he hopes you're well, and she read the text at the kitchen table. And Caleb was across from her, and eating cereal, and not on his phone. and which was unusual enough that she noticed it, and she put her phone down. He looked up. "And everything okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded and went back to his cereal. She looked at her coffee. She thought about Briggs Holloway, not with anger, and she had moved past the anger faster than she expected, which surprised her, and then didn't surprise her when she thought about it. She'd spent 14 years not being angry at Briggs Holloway, or anyone like him, and she'd spent 14 years being angry at something else entirely. Something that didn't have a face to put the anger on, which meant the anger had nowhere to go and had turned around and come back at her. And one Thursday evening had not resolved 14 years. She knew that. She wasn't naive about the arithmetic of grief and guilt and the time it took to work through them. But something had shifted. Not fixed, shifted. And the way a load shifts when you adjust your grip, and suddenly the same weight sits differently, and you can keep walking where before you needed to stop. She thought about what Ray had said. That's a whole career. And she thought about Caleb on the edge of the desk, looking at Jerome's gloves. And that's enough. She picked up her coffee. The morning went on. Briggs came on a Tuesday evening. She saw the truck from the kitchen window. Dark blue pickup she recognized from the gym parking lot. She watched it sit in the driveway for a moment. And a man sitting in a truck in a driveway was a man working himself up to a door. And she understood that. And she let him have the time he needed. She went to the door when he knocked. And he was standing on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets. No uniform. No black belt visible. A man in a regular jacket who had clearly been thinking about what he was going to say and had arrived at the door before the thinking was finished. "Ms. Webb," he said. "Briggs," and he looked at her, then at the porch. "I'm not here about the match," he said. She waited. "I already apologized for that, in front of everyone," and he paused. "That one I can live with. Being wrong about that, being shown I was wrong, I can work with that." She leaned against the doorframe. He looked up. "I used your son," he said. "I said his name out loud when you'd already told me no twice. And I did that because I knew it would work, and I wanted it to work. And he's 20 years old, and he was just there, on my floor, and I used him to get to you." And he stopped. "He's 20 years old," he said again. Like the number mattered. Like saying it again was part of what he was working through. "He didn't deserve that," Briggs said. "Whatever your history is, whatever I thought I was proving, he didn't deserve to be part of it." And she looked at him. He wasn't performing this. There was no audience, no students, no parents in folding chairs. And there was a porch and a Tuesday evening, and a man who had driven across town, because the thing he needed to say had been sitting in him for days, and the only place to put it was here. "And no," she said, "he didn't." Briggs nodded. He looked like he had more prepared, more sentences. She could see them in the way he was standing, like a man carrying something he wasn't sure he'd been relieved of yet. She said, "Why did you start teaching?" He blinked, and, not the question he expected. "Because I was good at it," he said. Then, slower, "because I thought it mattered. What you learned about yourself when you were willing to be in a fight, and not to hurt someone. Just to find out what you were made of when things got hard. That does matter," she said. "Yeah, but somewhere you stopped teaching that," she said, "and started teaching them that you're the measure of it." She paused. "Those aren't the same class," and he stood with that for a moment. His jaw moved slightly, not anger, something harder to sit with than anger, which was recognition. "I know," he said, quiet, the quietest she'd heard him, and she looked at him for a moment longer. Then, "Don't do it again." He met her eyes. "I won't." She believed him. Not because he'd promised, and she knew promises made on porches didn't automatically hold when you got back to your own floor with your own students and your own habits. And she believed him because he looked like a man who had seen something in himself that he hadn't known was there and couldn't unsee it now. That was the kind of change that lasted, and not always, but more often than the other kind. She nodded. He nodded. He walked to his truck. She watched him go. She closed the door, gently. She stood in the hallway. The house was quiet around her in the particular way it was quiet on evenings when Caleb wasn't there. And, not empty, just hers. The kitchen light was on. The radio she'd been listening to while she made dinner was still going, low, something she wasn't really following. She stood in the hallway and looked at the open door at the end of it, and then she walked to it. She went inside. She sat in the chair. She looked at the shoebox on the desk. She picked it up. It was lighter than she remembered, which happened with things you'd been dreading. They were always heavier in anticipation than in your hands, and she took off the lid inside a photograph, Jerome at 20 years old, and in the garage, and mid-drill, and one of the early sessions when they were both still figuring out what they were doing and doing it anyway, because figuring out and doing were not sequential, and they happened at the same time, and he was sweating and laughing at something off-frame. She remembered what it was. A joke she'd made about his footwork, something genuinely unkind that she'd meant affectionately in the way siblings could, and he'd laughed instead of being offended because that was Jerome, and he had never been easy to offend by the people he loved. She looked at the photograph for a while, then she looked at what was beneath it, a note, in his handwriting, on a torn piece of training log paper. And the paper had the faint grid of a logbook, and his writing was the way his writing always was, quick, a little sideways, the kind of handwriting that prioritized legibility over style. Round 6, you went for the outside trip instead of the throw. Wrong call, but good instinct, and work on reading the weight shift first. You're getting there. She had read this note more times than she could count. Not every day, but enough, and it was the last written thing of his she had. The last piece of his handwriting, which was its own kind of strange artifact, the physical trace of a mind that was gone. And you're getting there. She read it again, put it on the desk beside the box. Below the note, a saint's medallion, small, silver, worn to smoothness on the face from being handled. And the cheap kind from a church gift shop or a dollar store, the kind Jerome had kept in his gear bag because he wasn't especially religious, but felt that having it there was an acknowledgement of something he couldn't articulate precisely. She had taken it from his gear after, and she hadn't been able to explain why. Some things you took not for meaning, but because your hands needed something to do. She held it, felt the smooth, worn surface, put it down, and beneath the medallion, a ticket stub, row 12. Seat 7, the date, the arena, the event name, and the 2010 World Championship printed in the typeface of a ticketing company that had long since been bought by something else and rebranded. His ticket. They had found it in the rental car, and her manager had kept it and given it to her without explanation a week later, and she had put it in this box without looking at it directly, and had been both unable to keep it and unable to get rid of it for 14 years. She looked at it now. Row 12, seat 7, and he'd had a good seat. Not the best seat in the house, but a real seat. A seat with sight lines, a seat from which you could see the whole mat and the corner and the expressions on faces. And she thought about him, finding his seat, settling in. Looking at the program maybe, or not. Jerome never looked at programs. He always said he didn't need to be told what he was about to watch, and he would have gotten there and found his seat, and looked at the mat, and thought about what she was going to do and what the opponent was likely to do, and the places where things might get complicated. He would have done all of that, and he never made it to the seat. Row 12, seat 7 had been empty that night. She had not known that during the fight. She hadn't looked, and she used to scan for Jerome between rounds in the early years, when shows were small enough that she could find his face, but by 2010 the crowds were different, and she had learned to keep her focus internal. She hadn't looked. She wished she had looked, and not for any reason that would have changed anything. And Jerome was already on the highway by the time the first round started. Looking wouldn't have told her anything, wouldn't have changed anything. The outcome of that night was fixed by physics and timing, and a driver who ran a red light. But she wished she had looked, and she sat with that wish. Not the way she used to sit with it, which was like sitting with a verdict, like evidence in a case against herself. I didn't look, and I should have, and I was so deep in my own fight that I didn't look for my brother in the crowd, and she sat with it like a fact, a true thing. A thing that would always be sad. Not a verdict, just a fact. That was different. That was new. She put the ticket stub back in the box, the medallion. Jerome's note on top of both, the photograph on top of that, face up, and she put the lid on, but she didn't put the box back on the shelf. She left it on the desk. That was new too, and she was still sitting in the chair when her phone buzzed. Caleb. You awake? She typed back, yes, 3 dots. Then, can I come over? She looked at the time, late for a Tuesday, not impossibly late, just later than their usual. Yes, she typed. He arrived 20 minutes later, and she heard his key in the front door, his footsteps in the hall, and then he stopped. She knew where he'd stopped without looking, the open door. and he was looking at her through the open door, at his mother, sitting in the chair in the room that had been locked for 14 years, with a shoebox on the desk and 3 belts on the wall behind her, and he came in. He didn't sit on the desk this time. He pulled the small wooden stool from the corner, a stool that had been in this room since she moved in, and that she had never used and had never thought to move, and sat on it in front of her. "You okay?" he said, and she thought about the question. "Yeah," she said. "I think I actually am." He looked at the shoebox. "She put it there," he observed. "And I opened it," she said. He nodded. He didn't ask what was inside. She would tell him eventually. He seemed to understand that the rate of this was hers to set, and that his job was to be present while it happened, not to accelerate it. She looked at him on the stool, and he looked tired, the way 20-year-olds looked tired fully and physically, without the layered exhaustion of accumulated years, just the clean tiredness of a body that had done a lot and needed sleep. "And, why'd you come over?" she said. He shrugged. The Caleb shrug, meaning several things. "I kept thinking about what you said," he said, "about letting something out that you'd been keeping in." "Yeah, I think I've been doing that too," he said, "just with different stuff." And she looked at him. "Not about you," he said. "Or not only, just things I've been keeping. Things about how I thought this was, how I thought you were, and then Thursday happened and I needed to put it somewhere, and she understood that. So I came here," he said. She nodded. "Good," she said. They sat. The room was quiet around them. The 3 belts on the wall, Jerome's gloves on the desk beside the shoebox, the framed newspaper clippings, and the folder of papers she would open sometime but not tonight. After a while, she said, "Tell me something you've been keeping." He looked at his hands. "I used to think you quit something," he said. "Not fighting. I didn't know about fighting. And, I used to think you quit on something important when I was little. Something about who you were. Because you were always so contained, like there was a volume knob and it only went to about 30%. She listened, and I thought maybe that was because of the divorce, he said, or because of me. Like having me was the thing that made you turn it down. She felt that land. "Caleb," she said. He shook his head, and not looking for reassurance, finishing the thought. "But it wasn't that," he said. "Was it? It was Jerome, the room, the whole thing. You weren't turned down. You were just keeping it somewhere." She breathed. "Yes," she said. He nodded. "Okay," he said. "That's better." She looked at him. And better how? He looked up. "Because I can understand that," he said. "I couldn't understand the other thing. But I can understand keeping something, because it's too big to carry out in the open." And she thought about that. "Yeah," she said. Jerome's gloves were on the desk between them. He looked at them. "Kenna," he said, reaching toward them, asking first. She nodded. He picked up one of the gloves, held it, turned it over, and looked at the inside of it where Jerome's hands had been. He was a good teacher, she said. Even when he didn't know what he was teaching, he'd correct one thing and the lesson would be about 5 other things by the time he was done. And Caleb turned the glove over again. "Like what?" he said. "Like she thought. Like he'd correct my timing on a counter, and the actual lesson was that you couldn't force a counter. You had to let the opening come. And the lesson under that was that forcing things was almost always slower than waiting. And the lesson under was something about how you moved through the world, not just a fight." Caleb looked at the glove. "Don't fight the force," he said. And she looked at him. "You said that," he said. "When you showed me the takedown last month. You didn't explain what it meant. You just said it." She hadn't remembered saying it, but she knew it. "That's Jerome," she said. "Every part of that. The move and the words." And he put the glove back down carefully in the same position he'd picked it up from. Then he looked at her. "Will you tell me more about him?" he said. "Not tonight, and not all at once. Just eventually." "Yes," she said. She meant it in the way she meant things now, not as a promise to get to eventually and then not get to, and as a yes that was already partway to done because she had already started, and in this room, and on this night, and with a shoebox open, and Jerome's note on the desk, and her son on a stool, asking the question she had not known. She needed someone to ask. "And good," Caleb said. He stood. He put the stool back in the corner. She walked him to the door. He put his jacket on in the hallway. She watched him and thought about how long it had taken for her to understand that being a parent was not about what you withheld to protect them, and it was about what you eventually found a way to give. "Be careful driving," she said. "Always am," he said. He left. She stood in the hall, and then she went back to the room. She turned off the light. She left the door open. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. On Thursday, Caleb texted at 4 in the afternoon. "Back at the gym, you coming?" She put the phone down, picked it up again, put it down, and she washed the coffee cup in the sink, dried it, put it away. She picked up the phone. Yeah, she typed, "I'll drive." Iron Fist Gym at 7:30 on a Thursday looked the way it always looked, and black and red sign. Glass door she'd pushed through 3 times now. The smell that came before you were fully inside. The sound of bodies moving and a voice calling corrections across a training floor. She pushed the door open, and Avery Sutton was near the equipment rack, wrapping his hands. He looked up when she came in, and something moved through his expression recognition, and underneath it, something more particular, the way someone looked when they had done a thing they weren't sure was the right thing, and were now seeing the consequence of it, and finding out it was okay, and he gave her a small nod. She nodded back. That was enough. They didn't need to say anything about the television or the video or the week that had followed, and they had exchanged what needed to be exchanged already, in the only language that had mattered in that moment, which was action. Caleb was warming up on the mat. He saw her come in and cross the floor. "You want to sit," he said. She looked at the mat, and she looked at the folding chairs along the wall where she had sat 3 Thursdays in a row, looking at her phone, being invisible. "And no," she said. He looked at her. She took off her jacket. She folded it and set it on the nearest chair. She walked to the mat, not to the center. She found a section on the left side, away from the main drill line, open space. She sat down on the mat, cross-legged, and Caleb sat across from her. Around them the training session continued. Briggs was on the far end of the floor, running the advanced group through striking combinations, and she heard his voice from across the room. She listened for a moment. Something in it was different. She couldn't have written down what was different, or proven it in any measurable way. It was the difference between a voice aimed at a room and a voice aimed at a person, and he was talking to the student in front of him. Not to the students behind that student, or to the parents in the chairs, or to his own sense of authority, and just to the student. She didn't know how long that would hold. Old habits had weight to them, and the weight didn't disappear because of one Thursday, but it was different right now, and right now was what she had. She looked at Caleb. "Jerome's takedown," she said. He sat up. "And show me what you remember." "From what I showed you." He stood, moved through the first part, the step, the hand placement. He had the structure right, and the timing was off, and his hips were too high, and the angle of his right hand was slightly wrong, which meant he was relying on strength more than position. "And hips," she said. He adjusted. "More," she said. "Your center needs to be under his center. Not borrowing the force yet. You're pushing." He tried again. "Better. Not enough." She stood up. She positioned herself in front of him, and she took his hands and placed them at the right points. "Again," she said. "Slow." He moved through it slowly. She felt where he was compensating right side dominant, natural for him, which meant the move was easier from that side and needed more work on the other. "And other side," she said. He switched. "Worse." Which was correct, which meant he was actually learning it and not just performing a shape. Again, he went again. She watched his hips, watched his weight, and when the angle came close, she said, "There, hold it." And he held it while she walked around him and looked at the position from the angle. Jerome had always insisted on the diagonal, and the one that showed whether the center was truly under or just appearing to be. And it was close. She put her hand on his shoulder, adjusted the angle by a few degrees. He stilled under the correction the way a person stilled when they were paying real attention. She kept her hand there a moment longer than the adjustment required. She took it away. "And again," she said. He went again. Avery Sutton had drifted to the edge of their space. She noticed him the way she noticed most things, without making it visible that she'd noticed, and he was going through his own drills nearby, not watching directly, just near. She didn't mind. On the 4th attempt from the left side, Caleb got it clean. Not perfect. Perfection was a long way off and required drilling she couldn't give him in one Thursday evening. But clean, and the hips right, the timing honest, the force borrowed rather than opposed. Jerome would have said, "There it is. That's the thing I'm talking about." She said, "There it is," and Caleb came up from the motion and looked at her. She thought about Jerome at 20, in the garage, and calling the same thing to her, with the same quality of attention, the patient attention of someone who knew you were going to get it eventually and was simply waiting for eventually to arrive. She thought about the note in the shoebox. You're getting there. And she thought, I'm still getting there, Jerome. We both are. Again? Caleb said. Again, she said. And they kept going. The drill continued. Slow and then less slow. And then Caleb asking a question about the position of the far foot that showed he was thinking forward now, thinking about what came after the technique, which was the beginning of really understanding it. And she answered the question. She showed him the far foot. She adjusted his grip a second time. Avery watched from the edge without pretending not to. Briggs ran his group through combinations on the far end of the floor, and the gym moved around them the way gyms moved, noise and motion, and the particular rhythm of people working on hard things together. And in the middle of all of it, in a quiet section of mat on the left side of the floor, a woman taught her son a move that her brother had taught her in a garage with a swinging bulb and a mat that never quite lined up right. And the same move, the same hand placement, the same instruction she had heard at 20 and was giving at 42. And don't fight the force. Borrow it. She said it once. He nodded. He went again. Later in the truck, she started the engine and the heat came on. The working side, the driver's side, and the not quite working passenger side that she had been meaning to get fixed for 2 years. And she turned to Caleb. The heater, she said. He looked at her. I'm going to get it fixed. He looked at the dashboard, the vent on his side that blew lukewarm air at best. And you've been saying that, he said. I know, she said. I'm saying it again. This time I mean it. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. Okay, he said. She put the truck in reverse. She pulled out of the parking lot, and they drove with the heat running on one side and not the other, and the AM radio off and the street lamps going by one at a time. The silence between them was different now from what it used to be, and not empty. Not something being avoided. Just two people who had found, after 20 years and one room and several Thursdays, a way to be quiet together without the quiet meaning something was wrong. She thought about Jerome, and she thought about the garage and the note in the shoebox, and the ticket stub for a seat that had stayed empty. She thought about Ray's voice on the phone and what he had said about a different kind of career. And she thought about Caleb on the stool, asking to hear more about his uncle, and not tonight, and not all at once, and just eventually. And she thought about eventually. She thought it was closer than it used to be. She thought, I'm not going to spend another 14 years in those 5 minutes, Jerome. I mean it now. And I know I've said it before in the quiet of that room, and then not quite managed it, but I mean it now. And then she thought, you'd say good. You'd say about time. And you'd say go fix that heater, Nadine. And it's been 2 years. And what are you waiting for? And you'd laugh that laugh at the end, the one I don't remember what started it, but I remember what it sounded like. And you'd say go. Live the rest of it. I'll be in the room when you need me. I know, she thought. I know you will. She turned onto their street, and the porch light was on. She always left it on when she was going out and coming back, a habit from years ago that she had never thought to break because some habits were just part of the house now. And she sat for a moment. Caleb waited. She got out, and they stood in the driveway for a second, and both of them looking at the house, and the lit porch, and the ordinary quiet of a neighborhood on a Thursday evening. And same time next week, he said. She looked at him. Same time next week, she said. He nodded. He got in his car. She watched him back out and drive away, watched his tail lights at the end of the street, and then gone. She turned and walked to the house. She went inside. She didn't look at the door at the end of the hall, not the way she used to look at it, as a reminder of something sealed and permanent. She just walked past it. It was open, and the Rusum was there, dark now, the belts and the gloves and the shoebox and the note and the photograph of a 20-year-old man mid-law in a garage. All of it there, and all of it hers. She went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, stood at the window. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog somewhere, a car starting 2 streets over, the small ordinary sounds of a place where people lived their lives in all the ordinary ways. And she was 42 years old. She had a son who was learning a takedown. She had a room she could walk into now without the room closing in around her. She had a shoebox sitting open on a desk, and she had a note that said, "You're getting there." She had 14 years behind her and whatever came after that in front of her. She had a heater to fix. The kettle began its sound. She took her mug from the cabinet, the chipped blue one, and the hardware store logo faded to almost nothing. She poured. She held the mug with both hands. She stood at the window and she breathed, and the coffee was warm against her palms, and the street outside was quiet, and the room at the end of the hall was open, and she was still here, and still here she stayed.